You're listening to the Behind the Scenes Podcast Diary, episode number 11. Welcome to Amelia's Behind the Scenes Podcast Diary, an exclusive look at the behind the scenes misadventures of a 30-something thriller writer. Discover how close she is to releasing her latest novel, hear exciting details about upcoming writing projects, and discover the lessons she has learned along her writing journey so you don't have to make the same mistakes. You can find the episode show notes and lots more information at ameliahay.com/podcast/BTS. Hello writers, I've been thinking about the upcoming revision stage of the writing process for my thriller novella. My inner writing nerd wants to write something new while my inner coach is pointing toward my writing related goals for the year, and as a result highlighting how far away I am from achieving these goals. As you can probably tell by the super spoilery title of this show, I will be revising my thriller novella Missing over a 31-day period, and in this episode I'm going to break down my plans to revise in a month and the exact steps I plan to take during this revision period. So why 31 days? Well, I'm a bit of a flake and it's become clear to me that I cannot create without a looming deadline. The second reason for the short deadline is my novella Missing was written to an extensive outline which was revised before I started writing the first draft. As a result of my pre-writing habits, the novella will not need 3 months of revision because some of that revision has already taken place. I also believe that the longer you revise something, the easier it will be to lose sight of the original objectives for writing the story and give in to perfectionism. And this is a real problem of mine, putting things off and then obsessing over the tiniest of details. And I need to sort of move forward from that. I need to overcome that super bad writing habit because it's not serving me. Since episode 9 of the podcast diary, I've been struggling with writer's insecurity concerning the level of realism in my thriller novella. The protagonist in the series of thrillers that I'm writing is a journalist. Where I'm struggling is a journalist doesn't solve crimes for or with the police. They don't handle evidence, and this is precisely what my protagonist does in the earlier draft of Missing. Journalists do not help the police solve crimes in real life. This just doesn't happen. However, they do solve crimes as a part of a story investigation. While I do explain the friendship between the protagonist James and the police, I don't believe it's realistic, and if I don't believe it, then my readers will not. My insecurity with the level of realism with my story led to research and eventually posing a question about journalists solving crimes to a fellow thriller writer and former BBC radio journalist Paul Teague. Paul's answer led me to brainstorm bigger and better ideas for a few of the scenes in Missing, which in turn prompted my decision to start making plans and revise the novella. Before I dive into how I plan to revise a novel in a month, I think it's worth mentioning my process and experiencing while writing my thriller novella Missing. As I wrote the first draft for Missing, I experimented with sharing an earlier draft as I wrote. This decision led to editing and writing at the same time. I would write a few scenes and edit the earlier scenes in the story, then share the revised scenes on my blog. This process led me to become aware of the issues and pitfalls of my work as I wrote. Even though I have an extensive outlining process, there were still mistakes, but that should be of no surprise. Every writer needs to revise, no matter how extensive your outlining process is. It's a reality that's true for everyone. Editing and writing at the same time led me to experience a significant amount of writer's insecurity around my work. It caused me to fixate on issues instead of continuing to finish the first draft. This struggle led to huge gaps between writing sessions. So in theory, I was already aware of the failings of my story because I've read through the story so many times during the first drafting process. If If you want to revise a novel in a month, then you need two things: distance from your work and to know where your story falls short. Distance from your narrative allows you to obtain objectivity about what is working and what is not. I've heard of writers putting a manuscript in a drawer for 6 months. To me, that's a bit extreme. Instead, I recommend leaving your story for at least a week. But because I chose to use an alpha reader between my revised first draft and the revision phase, I've had to put this off a bit until January. So that's November, December. So it's about 8 weeks I've put off looking at my work. You need to do what works for you. Like, I'm saying 2 weeks and then just dive straight into it because you don't want to get in the habit of putting something off, but you also need to do what works for you. Don't look, read, or even think about your story during this time, whatever time frame you decide on. After this short sabbatical, read through your manuscript in a different format than you're used to reading it. I'm not a huge fan of printing out a manuscript because I'm not too fond of paper, but I do love paperback and hardback books, but that's a side issue. From my perspective, it's a waste, and I tend to throw paper away in the recycling because I don't like keeping things longer than what's actually necessary. But you do what works for you. I like to read my manuscript in the Scrivener app on my iPad. The Scrivener app for iPad visually looks different, and it's enough for me to see the story differently. Depending on my mood, sometimes I let my computer read back the scenes to me and I take notes as I listen. The only thing with the computer reading is it picks up on all the grammatical and spelling errors, and it's hard to look past these once you've become aware. As you read through the manuscript, pay attention to the larger story issues that jump out at you and start to create a list of things that you need to change. Revision is more than correcting grammar and spelling issues. To revise effectively, you need to take a macro point of view and then scale down to the micro point of view. In short, you need to focus on the framework of your story first before anything else. So what do I mean by story framework? I'm referring to story structure. For example, 3-act structure, the hero's journey, story grid, which is based on the hero's journey, and the save the cat method, all forms of story framework or structure. As you read through your story, you need to ensure the key scenes in your story framework are performing as expected. Are your key scenes, the ordinary world, inciting incident, and all of those other scenes moving the story forward? Fix these key moments first before you pay attention to anything else, including point of view issues, white room syndrome, and character arcs. After the moment of panic that I referred to earlier in this episode, I brainstormed ideas to change specific issues and created a list of scenes that needed to be rewritten. I then planned out a strategic approach for these rewrites. Establishing a sense of realism in my thriller novel isn't the only issue I'm facing with the next draft. I also know my novella has a host of other issues. In the next few sections of this podcast, I will highlight these issues and what I need to change within my story, just so you get an idea of the things that you might need to change, and just so you know what revision looks like for a writer. The reason why I really want to share this is when I finished writing first thriller that I wrote, Immunity, I was like, what do I do next? And I just had no idea, and people kept saying, oh, just read through your manuscript. When people talked about revision, it was just like, oh, read through your manuscript and look for the things that don't work. And I was like, it was just, it didn't make any sense for me. So this is why I want to spell out exactly what I'm going to do with my novella, just so you know this is what this looks like, just in case you're experiencing what I experienced and you're like, I don't know what to do. Issue number 1, point of view and character thought inconsistencies. When I outlined missing, I decided to write in third deep point of view, and I know I've been inconsistent with how I've written the scenes. As I was writing the first draft of Missing, my understanding of how to write a deeper point of view has evolved. Therefore, I know I've made mistakes, even though I can't tell you exactly where these mistakes will be found. This point of view decision also had a huge effect on how I revealed character thought in the narrative. narrative. I first started revealing character thought halfway through Immunity, which was the first thriller novel that I wrote. My love of character thought in narrative has filtered down into silence and missing. Even though I'm much better writer in missing than I am in my earlier novels, let's just say that I know I've broken a few rules and have been inconsistent with how I've shown the thoughts through the novella. At some stage I've said he thought, and then towards the end of the book I've started blending the character thought in amongst the narrative, where you really do experience the scenes solely from the point of view characters' view of their world and the way they think and feel about things. And so it's almost like first point of view, but it's written as third, if that makes sense. I sometimes feel that saying he thought does disrupt the reader from the story, and that needs to change. Issue number 2, setting and dialogue. I'm also quite confident that I have a bit of white room syndrome going on in a few scenes. I started out writing screenplays, and as a consequence, I love writing dialogue. As a result, I'm not used to having to paint a picture of the scene in detail. So scene setting and how it interacts with dialogue needs my attention as well. Even though I mentioned earlier I love writing dialogue, I'm going to pay attention to that as well. As I write, I play the scene over in my mind. Like a TV show or a film, then I write the scene. The dialogue is usually okay, but I want to create a sense that my characters are all individuals, and I want to give them a unique voice, but not sort of over the top, but I want the characters to feel like they're their own person, and they're not just characters on a page, that they're real. So those are the two main issues that I'm aware of. I guess the next step in the process is planning for the unknown, the things that I don't realize are a problem, so that as I do that first read through, that jump out at me. I mean, let's face it, that's going to happen. So I need to plan for that. At this point in my revision planning process, I have a list of plot issues to correct, point of view issues, character thought inconsistencies, white room syndrome, and dialogue all added to my revision list. The list I just read out are all the known issues in my manuscript. Now I need to make allowances for the unknown entities that will pop up as I read through my manuscript throughout the 31-day period, so I can meet the deadline that I've set. In the second novel in the BTS011 series, I have a significant issue with a character motivation which directly affects the plot. Spoiler alert, this means more rewrites ahead for me. So I'm going to assume that I've made a similar mistake, even though I was aware of this issue when I planned the outline for Missing. In light of this, I've added character arcs and motivation to the list of things to pay attention to as I revise my novella. Because I wrote 3 stories out of order, one after the other, I've become a better writer over time. Upon starting each story, I've added elements to my outlining process which have helped me to improve my craft. One of those things is the value shift. So what is a value shift? At the start of every scene, the character goes into the scene in one state and leaves in another state. As I revise Missing, I need to ensure that I've followed through with this value shift in every scene. The value shift will help me ensure that every scene in my story serves a purpose and that there is no dead weight clogging up the reader's experience. Because a reader will either lose interest, or they'll skip ahead, or they'll close the book, which is, I guess, categorized under the losing interest point I made earlier. So obviously as a writer, that's something I really want to avoid. So getting on top of these value shifts is something really is super important. By now, I guess you're wondering, how are we going to tackle such a long list of revision points? The official checklist of the revision elements for Missing is as follows. Plot: adding realism, new scenes, character arcs and motivation, value shifts within scenes, point of view, narration and character thought, setting, and dialogue. So that's essentially 4 huge topics. I've sort of grouped them into topics just to make it a little easier. You would have noticed that I've said nothing about grammar and spelling. I plan to perform line editing after all of the other things on the list have been addressed. So this may not happen during the 31-day period, but if I have time, I will do it. But back to tackling this list. The 31-day period starting from the 7th of January to the 6th of February has, I think, 23 working days, I'm going to plan to leave the weekends free to allow breaks within the revision process. I know I'm not good at working on something 7 days a week completely solid. I need to give myself a mental break. So I have 4 days to work on each element in my list with 3 extra working days. Before I start revising an element in my list, I will read through the manuscript and make notes, then perform the revisions. In order to avoid overwhelm, I will only pay attention to the element on the list that I'm revising and ignore everything else. As I look at this list, I do feel a little overwhelmed by the thought of revising. It seems like a daunting task, but it isn't. I'm merely going through the draft and improving upon what's already written. I have a feeling that I'm going to be one of those writers that will love the revision phase of writing instead of the writing the first draft, because the first draft is really, it's more of a brain dump. What I love is I love creating the story. I tend to lose interest after everything's been outlined because I've done all the creative things. I just need to do the hard work of putting it on the page, and that's sometimes why I take far too long to write a first draft. I just probably just need to sit down and just fast draft. Are you nearing the end of your first draft and not sure what to do next? If so, have you created a plan for revising your novel? Have you set a revision deadline? I want to hear from you. Let me know by coming over to the blog post and share your revision plans in the comments section. Thank you for listening to Amelia's Behind the Scenes podcast diary. If you're new to this podcast or want to be notified about more episodes just like this, then click the subscribe button right now. I'm your host Amelia, and I'll see you next week for another diary episode.